Can you explain really the initial beginnings of Bitcoin and how it got started and why it's at where it's at right now?
Right. Well, Bitcoin fulfills a basic human need that goes back hundreds of thousands of years, actually. And that is the need for perfect money. And that's what Bitcoin is, perfect money. And what we saw on January 3rd, 2009, when Bitcoin was released onto the internet, it was the beginning of a new chapter in human history, because up until then, we never really had perfect money like Bitcoin. And it's creating all kinds of fantastic changes to us as people, as humans. Now, drilling down a little bit, you could say more recently, the history of Bitcoin goes back to the 1980s and 1990s, 1970s even, where you had the cypherpunks who were always working on encryption and encryption technologies and bringing encryption to the masses as something the cypherpunks did. They kind of stole it from the Pentagon. They went on to work on creating Bitcoin, which is encrypted money that's unconfiscatable, that separates money from the state, which is a key feature of Bitcoin. And so finally, in 2009, the result of all this work came into existence. I was actually working in the 1990s. I was in Los Angeles, and I was working on virtual currencies at that time. I have a patent on a virtual currency. So I was very familiar with virtual currencies in the gaming environment. And so when Bitcoin came around in 2011, when we were first introduced to it, when it was a dollar, I immediately recognized the value. And so we started to get involved in the Bitcoin industry, and we started investing in a lot of Bitcoin startups. We own a portfolio of about 15 Bitcoin startups, including Kraken and Bitso and Shapeshift and lots of other names that are now multi-billion-dollar companies. I think Kraken is probably worth over $30 billion now. When we first invested, I think it was valued at $5 million. But to get back to the original point here, Bitcoin is perfect money, and this is why it's changing everything, and this is why it's very, very important.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's also important for us to really address the fact that now that it's being talked about, it's being embraced in a way. And in many ways, there's been some similarities towards the value of Bitcoin to gold. Now, you and Jimmy Dore kind of talked about this, but could you elaborate just a little bit more about maybe some of the advantages and disadvantages of Bitcoin being compared to gold, or either that, kind of explain like why is it now so valuable and that it's kind of being compared to that?
Right. Well, gold is good. It's a good form of money, and over thousands of years, it became the best form of money that we have as humans. And until Bitcoin came around and eclipsed it as really perfect money. So with gold, it's relatively scarce. With Bitcoin, it's absolutely scarce. With gold, it's somewhat portable. With Bitcoin, it's incredibly portable. Gold is divisible. Bitcoin is divisible to 100 million places, called the Satoshi. Mm-hmm. Gold is easy to confiscate. Mm-hmm. Bitcoin is unconfiscatable. And with gold, transactions have to be verified by a third party. Mm-hmm. So you need somebody to weigh the gold, or you need someone to assail the gold in terms of its purity. If you have any kind of gold, it's held in a vault and it has to be insured, has to be stored, storage cost, and you have a lot of problems with counterfeit gold, but with Bitcoin, the transaction is the verification. Mm-hmm. There's no third party required. It verifies itself. It's self-verifying. And so those are the advantages of of Bitcoin over gold. So it's similar to gold in a few ways, but it's vastly superior if you take into consideration what I just said.
Now, another thing too that people have been sharing about on the internet, be they critics of Bitcoin or supporters or just in between, there's been a lot of back and forth about what role it will play in the future. And for a lot of journalists, for example, there's some journalists that have used e-currency or Bitcoin to some extent. As we progress forward, how will e-currency, including Bitcoin, play a role, I guess, in how we live our lives? Because for a long time, I don't think anyone really expected the internet to really become the force that it is right now, and how it's basically part of our livelihood as well.
That's true. When I did my startup.com in 1995, the internet was considered to be a passing fad. Mm-hmm. I remember Paul Krugman at the New York Times wrote about it as having no more impact.
Paul Krugman is never wrong.
But that was the general feeling. And I was in Los Angeles at the time, and I know executives wouldn't put an email address on their business cards because they thought they looked too nerdy. No. It was not part of the culture. And then the Blair Witch Project came out in the 90s in Los Angeles, and they used the internet. Really was the reason it became a $200 million, $300 million grosser. And I think the total cost of the film was $60,000. So then that changed everything, So that was the beginning of people understanding. Netscape went public, and then we saw this explosion, that hockey stick moment. And suddenly people, instead of questioning, what would I ever use the internet for, they were saying, how can I possibly live without it, right? So it just totally changed. Similar with Bitcoin, we're at that moment now. Coinbase just went public. It's similar to the Netscape going public in 97. So Coinbase, and by the way, Mark Andreessen was instrumental in both companies. So now we're going to have this hockey stick moment of adoption. The price, of course, has been building for a number of years. It's about ready to explode much higher. And it's the thing about Bitcoin and what's driving it in a lot of ways, which people don't really appreciate, they don't really understand, is that Bitcoin has an insatiable appetite for energy. And it's going to get that energy wherever it can get it. Mm-hmm. And it's going to pull energy away from the fiat world. It's going to pull energy away from gold. It's going to pull energy away from the property market, from the bond market, because the way the technology is built, it has an insatiable appetite for energy. It's a monster looking for energy, and to drive, what's called the hash rate. So the hash rate is computational power of the network, and it's running at 170 quintillion calculations per second. So to put that into perspective, every grain of sand on planet Earth in total would equal about 7 quintillion grains of sand. The hash rate of Bitcoin is running at almost 200 quintillion calculations per second, and that's set to keep exploding higher. The hash rate's never been in a bear market. The hash rate's just been exploding higher for almost 12 years now, and that's not going to stop. So it will literally starve fiat money out of existence. It will starve the gold money out. It's already starving capital away from gold, and people are dumping their gold and buying Bitcoin. We see that already in the money flows, in the ETF market, and the banks are reporting on this. And the gold price has been very, very flat, even though we've got inflation and Bitcoin's trading higher and commodities are bursting higher. Gold's been very flat because a lot of the capital is moving into Bitcoin now. So it literally is this uncontrollable monster that is looking for energy, and nothing can stop it. There's no country or group of countries that could defeat Bitcoin at this point. It's too big. So that means that the price is going to keep going a lot higher. Mm-hmm. And it also means that these other competing forms of store of value or wealth preservation are going to be defunded essentially by Bitcoin because they won't have enough energy to sustain themselves. And it also applies, remarkably, it applies to the nation state itself. I mean, the U.S. is an incredibly inefficient, power-thirsty Goliath with a huge military that does very little but costs an awful lot. 1.5 trillion a year is the budget. And Bitcoin's going to capture that budget. It's looking for that budget. Bitcoin's got the Pentagon on its radar, and it's going to defund the Pentagon. It's going to defund a lot of things. And people, there's a saying in Bitcoin that you pay the price you deserve.